Test, test.
No, why does it say that?
No, you can sit there.
No, I'm living
Yeah.
there right now. No, it is. It is.
That's where I'm from.
What?
Because that's where I'm
Oh,
from.
you're from?
Yeah. So when I saw that, I was like, wait, what the heck?
It's like copy paste.
Good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to the Real World Perspectives on Poverty Solutions speaker series. I'm really excited about today's presentation by Bill Lopez, who has a lot of connections to us over at Poverty Solutions. And I'm very happy to introduce Melanie Puente, his research assistant, who will introduce him.
Hi everyone, I'm grateful to be here with you today and introduce Dr. Bill Lopez and give you all a snippet about all the amazing work that he does. So Dr. Lopez got his MPH from the University of Texas Health Science Center and got his PhD here at the Health Behavior and Health Education Department, which is now the Health Behavior and Health Equity Department, and is currently the Clinical Associate Professor and Associate Chair there. So he also has appointments at the University of Michigan as a faculty associate for Latino and Latina studies and is a faculty expert for poverty solutions. And his work with mixed status Latino communities led to his first book, Separated, Family and Community in the Aftermath of an Immigration Raid, which really looks to combine storytelling and research to give a sometimes heart-wrenching depiction of what that impact looks like, not just on individuals that are deported, but also on their family members and the community they left behind. And that book looks at Washtenaw County, so that actually was an Immigration Enforcement Act that happened not too far away from here back in 2013. And today, looking at his second book, which is a powerful follow-up to Separated, Raiding the Heartland, an American Story of Deportation Resistance, really brings us into the heart of communities that were impacted by large-scale ICE enforcement during the first Trump administration. And I'd say this is coming at, unfortunately, a time that is quite difficult for our communities in looking at the really just sheer escalation in scale and tactics that are happening right now, which can be a pretty tough thing to work in, but that's something I've always really appreciated about working with Dr. Bill Lopez is just the dedication in really centering the humanity of what is happening, not just to those deported, but again to the families, communities, and what I appreciate most of all, as well as really looking at the resilience and resistance that comes with that in the face of this enforcement. So without further ado, please join me in welcoming Dr. Lopez.
Thank you so much, Melanie, and it's so great to see everyone here today, so new and familiar faces. Special thanks to Trevor and the gang at Poverty Solutions for setting up this wonderful event. I want to talk to you today about the high cost of mass deportation But I want to get a sense of who's in the room, so raise your hand if you're in the MSW program or social work program. Great. I know I have at least one, but do we have other public health students in the room? Wonderful. And I know there's public health students joining us and professors and staff joining us on Zoom, so hello. To those public health folks in the School of Public Health, part of the deal I made with Trevor in doing this talk was that I'd be allowed to walk around. So have to forgive me if I move and the camera can't follow me, but Trevor agreed to let me walk around the stage. Wonderful. So MSW, MPH folks, great to see all folks. I know we have some people from the community as well. So I want to start with a story from my first book, from Separated. As Melanie mentioned, this story focuses on a work site and on a home raid that happened 7 miles from where you're sitting right now. Right? This is our neighborhood. This is our community. And on a Thursday in November of 2013, there was a good-sized home raid, at least for our community, where about 6 men were detained and about that many were deported. And ICE and the Washtenaw County SWAT team collaborated to arrest these 6 people after focusing on just one person, right, who I call Santiago. All names I use today are pseudonyms. So they looked for one person, and all these other men were swept up as collateral, right? Now, I wanted to interview Santiago. I wanted to see what it was like to be this person who was the target of a raid, a target that was allegedly so important that SWAT kicked in the door and took him out of his home. But his family said, no, you can't go to Mexico right now. His area was dangerous, that's why he left it. You can't go, right? And anybody who's written a dissertation can imagine what it's like to have to reframe your ideas right at that second, thinking, oh, I want to know what this is like. People need to know what deportation is about. And then having to think through what you're going to do next. And I remember distinctly, I went to the Dunkin' Donuts on Michigan Avenue, and I got 15 donuts and 2 coffees, and I went to Santiago's sister's house in Ypsilanti. And I sat there with her and her 2 children, and I later met her sister-in-law, Santiago's sister Fernanda, and her 3 children. And they told me about what it was like to be left behind after their primary breadwinner was removed. And I realized what I was seeing in that instance was the cost of deportation, that it wasn't just about who was taken and to where, but where they were taken from and who was left behind. So I started to understand this was about not only a person removed, but the family that they leave behind. But what I didn't realize is that I was seeing small, localized deportation, painless nonetheless, but what I wasn't seeing was the cost of mass deportation. At the time this happened in 2013, we were not in the period we are now, which is an era that we call, because Trump uses this language, the Trump administration uses this language, the period of mass deportation. So beginning in 2016 with the first election of President Trump, we saw a return to what we call large-scale worksite raids. And these are raids where numbers we put here anywhere from 32 to over 100 people are arrested and detained in one place. So what we decided to do, and when I say we, I mean multiple students in the School of Public Health here and the University of Iowa. I worked with a colleague, Dr. Nicole Novak, who graduated from our EPID PhD program, and we interviewed folks at all of these 6 sites. So every site in which there was a large-scale raid in 2018, we went to these sites to see what was the cost of deportation. But not only that, to see what communities did after these deportations. So it was through this work that I started to understand that what happened to Santiago and what happened to Guadalupe, his sister, and their families was the cost of deportation, but it wasn't the cost of mass deportation, right? It was part of the story, but it's not the full story. So what does happen? What changes in our society and in our community when we see deportation at the scale at which it's attempted to be implemented now? As I said, community members do not just stand by when people are removed. And this was an important part of the story that we wanted to tell. People don't let their neighbors get taken. What do they do instead? How would you fill in this blank? Instead, communities what? Yell it out. Who said that? resist. I thought it was going to be like the sixth response, but thank you, yes. Instead, communities resist. There was a cheat there because it's like the title of the book too, but yes, communities do not just let people get removed. Communities resist, right? And when I began talking about this was an idea that was kind of beginning to break through, but now if I asked, I bet you could give multiple examples of how communities are resisting. Because we're seeing it in Portland, we're seeing it in Chicago, we're seeing it in DC, we're seeing it in LA. Right? Communities resist, and we'll talk a bit about that today. We went to 6 sites, as I mentioned. I want to bring you into 3 of them today. I want to bring you into Bean Station, Tennessee, where a meatpacking plant was raided that resulted in absences throughout the county. What is the educational cost of deportation? Then I want to take you to nearby Ohio, to our neighbors in Sandusky and Salem. I just heard someone talking about Ohio. Are you familiar with these towns? What's that? Okay, from Toledo, yes, so you're familiar with Salem and perhaps Sandusky. More folks are familiar with Sandusky. Again, our neighbors. To think about the mental health costs of deportation, but maybe not as you've thought of this before. I want you to think about the vicarious trauma that comes for community members who are supporting immigrant communities. What's the cost for people like you, for people like me, who are advocating for these communities? And then we'll go to Mount Pleasant, Iowa, where we'll talk about the cost for immigrant families. Before we get there, I'll tell you a little bit about who I am and why it matters. What's this from? You laughed, so I know it. What's it from? Yeah, from Coco. This is one of my favorite movies, and this is one of my favorite scenes. I actually went to the theater to see this with my mom. And when the opening scene came out, and it was just kind of like acoustic guitar music, right? And my mom just kind of started sobbing, right? Just like seeing this Mexican art and music for the first time. And that's kind of what happened to me when I saw this particular scene right here. I'm from Texas, so I grew up with an awareness of the southern border, right? It was something we talked about. It was something we all understood. We knew people who had crossed it. Perhaps my generation or our parents' generation, our grandparents crossed it. Or some of us had been there since the border moved to the other side, right? But I knew that I understood what the border was in a deep way, but it didn't really hit me how I understood it till this scene in Coco. As a young Texan, we knew that the border was where it happened. It's where you tried to cross for a better life. It's where the Border Patrol tried to catch you and send you back. The border was a cruel desert at some points, a plain crisscrossed with barbed wire at others. It was where white people who owned the land at the border would yell migra, migra, and laugh as Mexican workers dove behind bushes. And for many, it was where you died, drowning in the Rio Grande. I realized how much I internalized this perspective, that immigration was about hiding from La Migra and drowning, when I saw Coco in 2017. When he first steps onto the bridge, early in the film, Hector, a comical skeleton who lives in the land of the dead, tries to sneak across a bridge made of marigolds into the land of the living. Hector's denied passage by a uniformed agent who scans his face with a computer at the base of the bridge. But jumping the turnstile, he sprints onto the bridge before any agent can catch him. When he first steps onto it, it appears to be solid and able to support his weight, but as he continues running, the bridge dissolves under his feet, marigolds shifting and adjusting with every step. Soon he's up to his knees in marigolds, then his waist, and then his shoulders. Hector begins to move his arms in a freestyle swimming motion, but the bridge he thought would take him to a better life in the U.S., the land of the living, is transforming into a river of flowers in which he's about to drown. This was clearly a metaphor for the surreptitious border crossing, right? The skeletal friend obviously representing the undocumented immigrant, the Marigold River, the Rio Grande, and the land of the living, the land of opportunity. And Hector's near drowning in an attempt to pursue it is just commentary on the immigrant experience, right? This is what I thought, and this is what I felt as I watched this scene in Coco. But doing the work you saw in Separated, or the work that I did in Separated, I learned that immigration enforcement up here in Michigan felt very, very different, right? It wasn't about that border. It wasn't about the river and the Rio Grande. It felt different. It was often one of our friends was taken away, or was detained and deported in the drive-through at Wendy's. You know, the restaurant Seva here, ICE agents ate breakfast there and then detained the workers there, right? So immigration enforcement in the Midwest, as I came to understand it, was very, very different. It's often the police, not La Migra, who take people away. And when ICE is doing the enforcement, people are taken out of their cars while driving kids to school, waiting for their orders of French fries. They are removed from their homes as they warm up dinner from their families, or they are forced out of their bathrooms, or they fled to protect their children. If I had to describe it, I understood deportation along the southern border to be sweltering and sweaty, dusty and dirty, physically grueling and bodily violent. But here in the Midwest, it was quiet, then violatingly climactic, traumatizing, then utterly, bitterly cold. So it's this perspective that I came to understand what we needed to talk about when we're thinking about deportation. That yes, it is bodily violent and physically harmful and often involves death, but also that a fundamental part of deportation is the threat of coercion, of family removal, and that up here in the Midwest, it's often very lonely and community is needed to support folks who are experiencing deportation. Let's talk a little bit about mixed status families. This is a very important part of the dynamic of deportation today. 22 million people live in mixed status families. That's 1 in 20. Mixed status family being people in the same household of different immigration statuses, often one or more people undocumented with someone who's citizen or has a visa. Right? About 2/3 of unauthorized immigrants have lived in the US for more than 10 years. So what we're seeing is the US population the immigrant population has just lived here longer. Now, why is that? Because that border that Hector was trying to cross and drowned in, as it became more secure, immigrants would stop doing circular migratory work, would come to the US, and would bring their families. So the increase in border security actually had this ironic impact of having folks stay here longer. What happens when you're in a place for 10 years? Yell it out. Someone said something? You stay there, yeah. What happens when you stay in a place for 10 years? Friendships, you become a part of the place. What would you say is a part of the place? What do you mean?
Like whether it's family, work, friends.
Yeah, friendships, marriage. You said work. What was the last thing? Community. Yeah, what else? What else, or how would you define that community if you had to break it down into pieces? Yeah, family, your family is here. Anybody else want to add anything? What's community? Comfort, I mean, you have your church, you have your work, you have your school, you have your kids' school, you have your pets, you have your car, right? You pay taxes, you're contributing to the economy, you're integrated in church, schools, community groups, you own a home, you own a car, right? So when you think about deportation, this is what I want you to think about. The cost of deportation, the cost of mass deportation is separating not only people from other people, but people from their communities, right? And so to break down that word, separating people from their homes, their businesses, their children. And I add pets, because what we see now when people are deported, they have to find who's going to take care of their pets, right? This is a very real situation. And we know that this fear of deportation, both this fear that this is bodily, physically dangerous, and that I could be separated from my family, already results in the high costs in health, right? So we know that there's decreases in prenatal care utilization, Medicaid participation, and on and on and on, right? There's all these health-related costs because of mass deportation and the fear of it. This is well established. It's well established in the literature. I'm very proud that lots of this came out of our field, in the field of public health, lots of it from our generation of public health researchers. But you notice the years, right? This is 2016, this is 2018, this is largely coming from Obama-era deportation. Was there lots of deportation during the Obama era? Certainly, right? 500,000 a year. It was pushing a record at the time. There's also a different type of deportation, a different type of targeting. We'll talk about that a bit today. Point being here was not the same era of mass deportation that we're seeing now, right? So we already know that there's all these costs to deportation, But let's go back to the question for today. What's the cost of mass deportation, right? Let's work on a way to think about what this means, mass deportation. We hear the word and we see it, or the phrase and we see it. So we visited these worksite raids. You see anywhere from 32 to 284 arrests. Now, the U.S. hadn't engaged in this kind of raid since 2008. So they had stopped. We returned to them during the first Trump administration. What they look like briefly is that millions of dollars and hundreds of agents are used to descend on a small town to remove people in those places. And to bring us into the current moment, I'll also remind us that last month, the largest worksite raid in U.S. history occurred. So we are absolutely in historic times, right? 475 people were removed. You see, this was 284. It was an astronomical number in 2019 when it happened. Now we're going up to almost 500 people. Right? Let's think about some of the costs of these raids, but I want first for you to hear how community members described them. So as we talk to people throughout the country, they tried to put words into what it was like to be around a large-scale worksite raid. And for those of you who've done qualitative work, you realize that there's often this moment where you're talking to someone and they've never talked about the phenomena for the amount of time you're allowing them and inviting them to talk about it, right? People would talk to me about a worksite raid for an hour. When is the last time you've talked, not back and forth, but you have talked about one single thing for an hour? It generally doesn't happen. And it's a beautiful part of interviewing. What you do is you can see people work through these ideas. And they often began by comparing worksite raids to natural disasters. Specifically, in the Midwest, this often meant something like a tornado, right? And Al, a volunteer from Mount Pleasant, Iowa, said something that's happened. First, he compared it to a disaster, like a tornado coming down and taking out 30 houses on the edge of town. And then he said it was like a wildfire. The wildfires were happening in California at this time, and he compared it to the wildfire. And there would be this disaster comparison, but then people would realize, oh, it wasn't just like the disaster, it was also like the response. And remember when we responded to Hurricane Katrina in Knoxville, they had this Red Cross Center. So people transitioned into like, this was a disaster. There were masses of humanity that needed help afterwards. And we frequently saw comparisons to phrases, to war zones. We saw war zone, we saw a public execution, in comparisons to death. We saw Father Jim, who was a priest in Morristown, Tennessee, and was in the National Guard, had served in Iraq, said, we prepare for mass casualty events. And he said this was like triage. And Leah, a teacher in Mount Pleasant, also brought the idea, and this is a community memory. We are shaken up by this on a larger scale, something like a school shooting, or in this case, 9/11, when the Challenger blew up. I share this because I want you to understand the scale of what this is like in a community in which it happens, right? I'll tell you three things. So first of all, worksite raids are chaotic, violent, and traumatic. Second of all, there is no clear beginning and end. When we talk about raids and enforcement, we talk about it as if it happened and it's over. But there's no delineation in the community. Pastor Juan, who we met in Paris, Texas, described this using a phrase that I love, tocando la puerta de fulano de tal. Who wants to translate that for me? I know Christina could, but I won't make her. Okay, go ahead. Yeah, knocking on the door of so-and-so, right? And what he said by this is he was explaining it, and he was saying like, oh, now migración está en la Walmart, la migración está en la gasolinera. Like, nobody knows where they are. Nobody knows where their arrests will stop. Are they in your home? Now, see, what I do is distinguish worksite raids and home raids, and we distinguish your protections in worksite and home and street from ICE and Border Patrol and police. So what we do as researchers, right, we make these distinctions. On the ground, a uniformed man is knocking on a door. You don't know when it's stopping, and you don't know what they're going to do, right? So this fear just doesn't end. And worksite raids always have been, and we're seeing it more now, are rooted in racial profiling. We see continued records of raiding these facilities and separating Latino from white workers and asking for the papers of all the Latino workers, right? A student artist who I'll introduce you to at the end drew this in the follow-up to the raid in Bean Station, which 98 people were arrested in Tennessee. And we saw our White House border czar, Tom Homan, confirm that language, that accents and physical appearance are one of the things that ICE looks for as evidence. Always been part of immigration enforcement. It's just more on the surface now. So what does this do? What does this do to a community? Let's look at a few things that happen. First, I want you to think of the educational costs of mass deportation. This might be one that some folks have not thought of before, but one of my favorite things in public health is when we're able to bring something up that once we bring it up is so obvious, you're never able to let it go, right? So Bean Station is a very small town in Tennessee, 3,100 people, 3% Latino, right? So very, very small, majority white population. And it's home to a meatpacking plant called Southeastern Provision. Many workers live in nearby Morristown, which is in Hamlin County, which because of those workers and other Latino and immigrant families increases the percent to about 15. So this is bigger than normal, bigger than Ann Arbor, but still is a very small proportion of Latinos, right? Why is this important? Because in places like certainly LA, Chicago, we have a different dynamic, and it's important to ask ourselves how we organize with such small percentage of migrants in these communities. Now, just like in other towns throughout the country, as we said, when a population is in a place for over 10 years, you integrate, right? You have quinceañera dresses you sell, and 15th birthdays you got to celebrate. You have food, you have groceries, and we saw these signs. Even at 3%, this was outside of Bean Station, even at 15%, you see this sign of integration into communities. Now, when people are removed, you're removing not only store owners, but you're removing store customers, right? An important part of what we think of in the immigration, in the cost of immigration. All right, so this is the rate at Bean Station. So this is a meatpacking plant in which these workers were taken out, 98 people were detained. What are some things we notice about this picture? Anything? Why? It's mostly white agents and it's mostly men working. That's correct. So I will get to the gender dynamics of these later, so keep that thought in mind. What's some other things we notice? Yeah, what time? 9:20 a.m. What day of the week? It doesn't say here. I think it was a Tuesday. 9:20 a.m. Where are all of these people, all of these workers? Where are their kids? Every single time a worksite raid happens, with the exception of when they're in the summer, of course, every single time it happens, these children are at school, right? Every time. Great thing about public health is we bring up the obvious and you can never forget it every single time they're in school. This raid set off the other raids, right? So it's the first in the series of raids. As you said, as I wanted to point out, 9 in the morning, everyone's in school. Everyone's in school, right? So this is a town in nearby Morristown, Tennessee, next to Bean Station, as I mentioned, where most of the Latino workers work and their kids go to school. Anonymous names, and I blocked out the name. Anonymous street names, and I blocked out the name. So we were able to visit this school and talk to some of the teachers about what it was like in the aftermath of the raid and how it impacts student education. And one of the things I want to bring up is you see this piece by Jonathan Blitzer. An ICE raid turned the lives of hundreds of Tennessee kids upside down. And he says 530 absences in the days after the raid. So generally speaking, 530 absences is a lot, right? A lot of kids are absent. A good question is, well, how many kids are normally absent, right? Great, for everyone who paid attention to stats, yeah, what's the comparison? 575, normal day, 75 students are absent. So we're from 75 to 575 absent children. Now, what we see also, Sofia Avila is a student in Princeton, so I am really impressed that she was able to get this work out so quickly. But after the raid in Texas, exposure to a raid lowered the scores and passing rates of Hispanic students in standardized tests, right? And not just in the day after, 40 days after the operation. So this is over a month later. Hispanic students' scores went down on their standardized tests. Not white students, right? Hispanic students. And why? Because they're scared of the enforcement that I described for you. Enforcement that's traumatic, enforcement that they don't know when it ends, and enforcement that is rooted in racial profiling. And you see this because the behaviors only change among one of the racial groups, right? 475 people, 75 people who are absent. Now, a good question is, does this only happen after work site raids, right? And the answer is no. Another friend and colleague, J. Jacob Kursky, at Texas Tech University, just looked at numbers of deportations in this paper, Deportations Near the Schoolyard, and just finds that areas with more deportations result in a white Latino gap, larger in math achievement and rates of chronic absenteeism. Higher districts mean more Latino kids do not go to school, right? Now, who is it that's going to have to not only, who is it that's going to address these gaps? Yeah, the teachers, right? So this is yet more that we, as the United States, are placing on the backs of our teachers, right? Teachers have to address this growing gap. 680 workers. So one of the other questions would be, ICE is a government agency, public schools run by the government, shouldn't they coordinate, right? Shouldn't the teachers at least know when this is going to happen? A reporter asked Trump this question. So 680 immigrants were taken on the first day of school in Mississippi, the first day of school. So the reporter asked President Trump as he boarded Marine One en route to fundraisers in the Hamptons, why wasn't there a better plan to deal with the migrant children in Mississippi? Trump said, the reason is because you have to go in, you can't let anybody know. Otherwise, when you get there, nobody will be there. I want people to know that if they get into the United States illegally, they're getting out. They're going to be brought out. And this serves as a very good deterrent. Now, communities don't just let people be taken. Communities don't just let their kids not go to school. What do? Yes, what do? All right, so let's see how they resisted in Bean Station, Tennessee, right? All of these teachers, we talked to teachers in Bean Station and we talked to teachers outside of Sumner, Texas. Sylvia was the principal of Mountain View Elementary, and to her, this wasn't just about grades and absenteeism. Where do low-income students go to get their meals? School. So we also see that students are not only, that there's not only a grade gap, but students aren't eating. And she said, yeah, in the South, in Tennessee, you don't let people go hungry. And what she and people in, what her administration, her school board, her teachers, and others in Texas did is they packed up food and they drove to every single one of those students' houses to deliver food to them so that they would be able to eat, right? And not only did they do this, the day after the raid, as Leslie and Ted, who are two teachers in Mountain View, said, they did this all through the summer. So these teachers were so dedicated, they started delivering food to feed these students for the rest of the summer, right? Now, another thing we see here is individuals are working across lines. These are citizens, across lines of citizenship status, and at least in rural areas, certainly across lines of race. It was white and Latino communities beginning to work together. So when you think of the cost of mass deportation, there's a clear educational cost in the sense of actually going to school for some students and a racial gap. Let's look at another cost. Let's look at the psychological harm of supporting immigrant communities. Salem and Sandusky, who's been to, I'll go with, which one? You've been to, has anybody been to Salem? Very tiny, as you can see, right? Well, bigger than Bean Station, but still small. And who's been to Sandusky? So lots of us. What amusement park is there? Yeah, Cedar Point, exactly. So lots of us have been to Cedar Point. I point that out because, again, this is deportation happening right in our backyard. You could see the helicopter that descended upon this plant from Cedar Point, right? Like, this is happening in places we have been. Cedar Point, Salem, 1,100 people, and Sandusky, about double, a little more than double, 2,400. Both very, very small Latino proportions, percent Latinos. But what's notable about this is these two worksite raids in Salem, Ohio, and in Sandusky and Castalia, Ohio, occurred about 14 days apart, right? So this is a once-in-a-lifetime raid that occurs twice within a month. Now the people, we met one advocate, and her name is, we'll call her Kimberly. And Kimberly was a wonderful advocate. She and many others helped organize resources for families. This is one of the churches in the city that sat in between Sandusky and Salem. Now, whether that positioning was lucky or unlucky, kind of depended on the person, but it meant that those advocates actually had to serve two communities and deal with the damage of the raid twice, right? So 140, 114 people. You could tell that it was taking its toll on people like Kimberly. Families tended to huddle in churches because they felt safer and because they were hungry. And churches were places where you could go for food, and churches knew how to raise money for food. So Kimberly played a big role in organizing. She was a fantastic organizer. And when you do qualitative work, you meet people who are so good at organizing, and sometimes it really works to your advantage. So she was so good at organizing that when we and our students here wanted to interview some folks who had been involved in the raid, she was like, sure, you can come in, bring whoever you want. And she set up like half a dozen interviews for us, right? So we had all of these students interviewing all of these people who had been engaged in the raid response. And Kimberly, she was articulate. She had taken social work classes. She had her bachelor's. And as my colleague Nicole was interviewing her, right? And as she wrapped up the interview, this is how it went. We wrap up our conversation with Kimberly, excited to split our 7-person team among the multiple interviewees who have joined us at her invitation. Before we close the interview, Nicole invites Kimberly to take a step back from her description of the rich organizational response and comment on the personal impact of the work Kimberly was doing. She asks Kimberly, we're going to wind up. I just wanted to ask one more time, just about your experience personally through all of this. How has it affected you? And Kimberly pauses and takes a breath before answering Nicole's question. She stutters a bit as she starts to respond. It's the first time in the interview that she seems a little unsure of herself, as if what she's about to say is entirely unpredictable, even to her. It's really awful to see, she says. These first few meetings, I mean, these are young boys who literally came to us crying and sobbing, and adults who are coming crying and sobbing, and you feel that there's very little that we can offer. It's infuriating, it's devastating. We were working around the clock until midnight every day for months, and it was completely exhausting. Like, to me, it felt just like vicarious trauma. And one of the things about qualitative work also is that sometimes you don't know what you're looking for until a participant describes it for you, right? We begin to see all of these signs of advocates breaking down. And then when Kimberly used this word vicarious trauma, I understood, oh, that's what I needed. We needed a connection to what was going on. What does the research say? What is going on psychologically? So we did a little bit more digging, and we see plenty of research about vicarious trauma in therapists. So this is a meta-ethnographic review. What does the data say? What does the data say the cost is to people like Kimberly? And as you see here, individuals present with a range of symptoms that mimic post-traumatic stress disorder, right? So we're likely to see what Kimberly was describing and we'd hear others describe are these symptoms of PTSD, with one that really stood out. There's a real sense of these emotions being overwhelming, draining, and difficult to control, right? I realize this is the framing that we needed for what we've been hearing. And I'll read you just a couple of other excerpts from the interviews of advocates. Stacy told us, I remember me and a colleague, we started doing almost nightly Facebook Lives just to update on what was happening, what was needed, and what we were learning, thanking people for their donations or asking for more. I remember it was the only time that we sort of stopped or talked in a coherent way about what was happening, But there was one Facebook Live broadcast event where we entered the broadcast because we just started crying. Now, this feeling have this happen over and over again. Diane told us it felt like a nurse in an emergency room having to triage who's the most important to help even though everyone else deserves help. That was really hard because we'd have to explain to individuals who had been released in O'Neill, it was almost like saying, I'm sorry, your case is not as important as someone else's right now. That is really difficult to say. You're out of jail, someone else isn't. We have to get help to them more quickly than you. Now, she wasn't a nurse, but we did speak to a nurse, and I asked her, what's it been like to be a volunteer for you, to be witnessing all of this, to be driving people around? And she said, I've been a hospice nurse, so I've been with many people as they've left the world, and I will tell you, there's nothing that has wrecked me like this, and I've been a nurse a long time. It's deeply disturbing to me. I want to give one more example. Anika was a law student who responded to the raids in O'Neill, Nebraska, coming from the other side of the state. Her father was a Guatemalan immigrant, and she said, I had to help, I had to do something about it. And she gave very clear examples to us about what had led her to this point of breaking down. She told us, like one person was saying, that they had sent dogs after them at one of the farm locations, and that one person was trying to escape from the dogs, so he was crawling through like a pig pen or something. So he was covered in pig feces and stuff. He didn't escape. The dogs got him and they ripped up his clothes and stuff. So he spent hours, he spent overnight in detention with these clothes. And then there were some moms that the babies were breastfeeding when they got detained, so they had no food that night for the baby. And she said, at one point, I didn't even realize how stressful it was. We hardly took any breaks. Like we hardly sat down to eat or anything. And I took a bathroom break at one point, and I didn't realize how intensely emotional it was until I had to throw up in the bathroom because I was so anxious and stressed from hearing all the things that these people were telling me. So what Kimberly and so many others were telling us were clear symptoms of PTSD, were clear symptoms of what I would say was vicarious trauma. Now, one thing that the vicarious trauma research also tells us is that it's possible to learn from experiences of suffering of others, especially immigrant and refugees, when you see them conquering these challenges and experiencing a better life. However, what we see is that if there's a political impasse, meaning immigrant and refugees are unable to move past these challenges, this again leads to this crisis moment among their therapists and counselors and helpers. The ensuing impasse to legislation and government policy often results in professionals feeling shattered, drained, and impotent. These are what our community members were describing when they were bringing their help to immigrants. Now, there's not research on this, as you can imagine, right? But what we're seeing is also a clear escalation in who the administration is willing to physically hurt. The argument that I'm making to you right now is part of the cost of mass deportation is you are emotionally and psychologically harmed when associated with an immigrant community. But to me, to us, it's evidently clear that the administration is also willing to physically harm you. As we see here, more tackles, more gunfire. We see, unfortunately, if you remember the pastor shot in the head by the pepper ball recently. And this serves as a very good deterrent, Trump said, about the immigration raids that resulted in the arrest of 600 workers on the first day of school in Mississippi. I want to ask you, a deterrent for whom? Are worksite raids and mass deportation and all the chaos and cruelty that define it meant to deter immigrants from crossing the border, or to deter others in their community from seeing them as human and supporting them? I'll say the answer is probably both. If you cross the border, you'll be separated from your family and deported. If you help someone who crossed the border, you may find yourself throwing up in the bathroom. Now, Communities don't just accept this secondary trauma. Communities resist. Yes, communities resist. Communities think of ways to push back. Now, what we saw in church after church after church was this clear collection. This is, I didn't show food here, but a food, right? So one of the first things that goes when immigrant communities are scared to leave their homes and have lost a breadwinner is the ability to feed themselves. And we saw folks continually move into churches to be able to be supported by their community. We also saw diapers collected all the time, everywhere. Now this is touching, right? This was inspirational to see it, but I was often left shaken by this, that if I were to define worksite raids by one single artifact, I would probably define it by diapers. They were just collected everywhere because they were too expensive for families to buy, right? But nonetheless, the logistical organization that this took was built by women like Kimberly who worked through this vicarious trauma. And I'll also say that what Kimberly did was a really impressive rideshare system. Now, one of the ironies of detention and deportation is that when you're detained, when you're released and asked to come back later for your deportation, you actually have to do a lot of things. You have to go check in with ICE, you often have to get thumbprints, go to the doctor. All the while, in most states, undocumented folks don't have a license. So ICE is asking them to go do all of these things that in our community often require 30 minutes to an hour of driving. So what Kimberly did was organize people who could drive, who would not be racially profiled, and who had lots and lots of time on their hands. Anybody can guess who would fit that mold? What's that? Yeah, who said retirees? I thought I heard it. Yeah, retirees. So she and other church members worked with all of these folks who had retired in their church, right? And what I love about this example is that she's specifically matching needs. You can't drive if you're Latino, you can't drive if you have a license, and this takes a lot of time. You wouldn't think about those needs unless you had been embedded in the community as she had. So let's end with one more example in Mount Pleasant, right? So we've talked about being stationed, we've talked about Ohio. Let's move on to Iowa now. And we'll move to Iowa, Mount Pleasant, Iowa, population of about 9,200, about 9% Latino, about in the range that you've seen, right? Primary business includes manufacturing, includes cement production. Now, this is another church that we went to in Mount Pleasant. In Mount Pleasant, just like throughout the country, there were churches always where people would gather. And I really wish I could show you the picture of the couple that I interviewed in this church. Juana and Alicio are the names I use for them. Juana and Alicio, at least Alicio was undocumented. I did not know about Juana's status. And they had 2 kids, ages 4 and 7. And rare are these moments when you're a researcher where you're talking to 1 or 2 people who can describe a phenomena so richly, right, that you feel like you have nothing else to learn. I was in this moment talking to Juana, who wove this beautiful tapestry of what it was like to find out that Alicia was detained. She talked about the teachers who told her, she talked about the church, she talked about the demographics of the town, she told me everything about the context. As she was telling me this, Alicio just sat there in his chair, and I remember him sitting like this, tense, like coiled, like he was going to strike. And I was trying to figure out why he wasn't sharing, right? And I eventually caught on that Juana's perspective of what was on the outside was fundamentally different than Alicio's perspective of what it was like to look down the barrel of the gun when you were in a facility that was raided. And I finally invited Alicio, tell me about this. What was it like to be in the raided facility? And together, they said everything you could imagine about what it was like to fear your own death, as well as to hear about the detention of your husband from the outside, right? And as the interview went on for about an hour, and we kept talking about the situation. And at one point, Juana finally tells me she found out that Alicio was detained, and she calls his business, and she's like, the cement packing factory, cement mixing factory. I was like, what do I do? Is this true? And she, like many of the other mothers and wives, were told, well, come pick up your husband's things, right? So I want to read for you that portion of the interview because it brings us back to the research that we have about couples like Juana and Alicio, and those couples suffering more than anybody else we've described, right, due to the impacts of mass deportation. Juana describes the scene on her arrival. So she's coming into the cement mixing factory. On the tables in front of her sit bowls of half-eaten soup and tortillas with bites taken out of them, food they had just purchased from a woman who makes it fresh. Helmets, which make the dangerous work of mixing, pouring, and moving concrete a little safer, are lying on the tables, having just been removed to make the lunchtime gathering a little more relaxed. The room, as Juana describes it, is laid out like many other precast concrete factories throughout the country, with a large space to mix and pour concrete on one side and offices for supervisors to watch on the other side. She describes the only people left in the factory, those supervisors. Those in the office were sobbing, just watching out of their windows. Obviously, the supervisors knew that the workers had kids, had wives, and it was like, what's going to happen to them? They were also in shock. So this invisible line in the middle of the factory floor dividing the heavy labor of making the cement from the intellectual space of the office also served as a line of racial demarcation. Everyone in the middle of the room who was mixing cement was Latino. Everyone in the supervisory offices were white. So I'm a little rattled by the scene Juana's describing. White managers sobbing, Latino workers disappearing, and Latino wives picking up their husbands' belongings. Now, at times like this, when an interviewee captures the moment better than I ever could, I usually sit there, use body language, and invite the interviewee to elaborate on the moment as long as they want. I'll repeat the scene back to the interviewee slowly and simply, both to make sure I understand what's going on, as well as to invite them to confirm, change, or emphasize certain details of the story. So I ask Juana, so it was the white folks watching the Latinos pick up their things. I thought I had stated it simply enough, but Juana pauses. She didn't confirm my summary, nor does she expand it. So I'm confused and caught a little off guard. Clearly I've missed something. Clearly I've said something wrong, but what did I miss? Now Juana remains quiet for a beat, as if thinking through the question. Then replies, realmente, cuando yo llegué ya no había ni un trabajador. Actually, when I got there wasn't a single worker still there, she tells me. So Juana was not really correcting me. She's instead working through an issue with the language and the gender that I had not noticed when I summarized the situation. No, los Latinos were not picking up the belongings. Los Latinos, the men, the husbands, the fathers, and the workers, they were all taken or had disappeared. It was las Latinas, the women, the wives, the mothers, who were picking up their belongings. Los Latinos were gone. It was just soup, half-eaten tortillas, and overturned helmets, and Latinas left on the factory floor. Now, this small issue in this language distinction, language perhaps mistake that I had made or at least overlooked, reminds us to go back to your point of how gender is shaped, how the impacts of deportation are fundamentally shaped by gender. All right. Now, some of the research tells us that mass deportation is part of a gender deportation regime. This means that it's mostly men who are removed and mostly women left behind to counsel their children and raise the money for their partners, lawyers, and bonds. This often results in what Joanna Dreby calls suddenly single motherhood, in which a mother who is raising a family with another parent suddenly finds herself in a position to have to raise those children alone. And this also results in failed paternal gender roles, meaning immigrant men who come to the U.S. who work and want to protect their families psychologically and emotionally collapse in detention because they're unable to do the thing on which they define themselves. And lastly, it forces children into abrupt transitions to adulthood. What that means is that if you're 16, you start working when your father's detained. If you're in college, you drop out of college and you make money when your father's detained. And if you're an older sister when your father's detained, you become the mother, you become the father, right? Children are transitioning from one stage to their adult stage because of the removal of their parent. The costs of mass deportation, I hope, are clearer after this. There's educational costs. There's psychological costs, not only to those who are experiencing deportation, but to those who support them. And there's costs for immigrant families first and foremost. Now, as we've talked about, communities resist, and Juana was one of the best examples of this type of resistance. Juana actually ended up working in the food pantry in the church in Mount Pleasant that I showed you. And she served as this point of contact for other immigrant families in the community. So slowly this church that was predominantly white, reflecting the demographics of the town, slowly became at least more filled with a Latino population because of this point person who understood the dynamics of the church, the food pantry, and the immigrant dynamics. But one of the things we saw throughout all these examples of why this would first, while these advocacy efforts would start addressing an emergency, like finding diapers and food, they would always grow into something bigger. And this is one of my favorite examples, because what started as a food pantry in which you moved stuff, and you all can envision this in a church. There's an extra room, let's move stuff to the side, and let's put food in there, right? Let's move computers to the side so that we can put diapers in there. As people don't need diapers anymore, what do they need? Well, let's use the computers for ESL, for language lessons, right? So there was this continued effort to use what was the resources that were first emergency to allow folks to address the system that caused these emergencies to begin with. I want to end with Juana's words here. You can read them here, and I want to read them out loud for her as well. She says, "The raid impacted us, but we are moving forward. And I hope to God that sometime soon there is some change, and we can be at peace and be able just to do what we want to do, to teach our children how to move forward and to struggle for what they want. And as I tell my husband, I'm here for as long as God wants me to be, because I want to see my children growing up. I want to see the children graduate. I want to see my children say, Mamá y papá lucharon por nosotros, por nuestros futuros, y por darnos algo mejor. Mom and Dad fought for us, for our futures, and to give us something better." Special thanks to my friend and colleague, Nicole Novak, who did all of this work with me. She was a wonderful thought partner and collaborator, and we had the best time going to all of these places and being invited to many, many kitchens and eating much delicious food throughout the work. The art you saw comes from Carolina Jones and Dahlia Harris, since graduated from U of M. We had wonderful students both at University of Michigan and the University of Iowa. Every site we went to, we were blessed to have wonderful community partners in all 6 locations. We had multiple partners who helped us navigate the town, feed us, and facilitate the interviews. Funding came from the Prevention Research Center of Rural Health at the College of Iowa, University of Iowa College of Public Health, the Institute for Research on Women and Gender, and the DCC Documenting Criminalization and Confinement Project of the Carceral State Project at the University of Michigan. And I'd love to continue the conversation. You can see my contact information there, email, Instagram, books, and you can see the art as well. Lastly, to promote a couple of new events, we'll be involved in a Stories That Shape Policy Immigration Narrative in the Public Sphere with Senator Chang on Monday in Will Hall. And the work that you saw, the art that you saw, is also presented in a wonderful exhibit at Lane Hall by the Institute for Research in Women and Gender. It began in October and will finish December 12th. So if you have time, I invite you to go over and check it out and leave some comments. So thanks, everyone. I'll turn it back over to Trevor. Happy to take questions. Before I do, I tried to provide a little bit of hope by talking about what advocates are doing, but why not add a little bit more celebration? I hear it's somebody's birthday today. 35th, I hear, maybe 37th, somewhere in there. So can we all wish Trevor a happy birthday?
An excellent and very gracious repurposing of your applause, Bill. So, what questions do we have for Dr. Lopez?
What kind of suggestions do you have for the No Kings rally?
Yeah, sure. So No Kings Rally taking place Saturday. How many, you mentioned how many places?
2,500 within the United States and some outside the United States.
2,500 within the U.S. and many outside of the United States, right? Great. I encourage folks to attend anytime there's these type of mass gatherings, because we need to be visible and we need to protest and be together in community, right, as we work through these issues. Advice, first of all, attend. Second of all, it's important to be able to film, and we remember we have a legal right to film when we're on public property. It's important to also remember that some of this could be dangerous, and to be aware of how to respond in those cases, right? So one of the things I do like to bring up is that we see more and more risk involved in protest. We left a generation where lots of our advocacy was very, very public. We remember the DREAM Act leading to DACA happened because of lots of public presence of undocumented immigrants, right? Undocumented, often youth, often students, but we see an era where there's much more silence. And this means a few things. It means we need more folks like those retirees who are able to be in spaces, who won't be racially profiled, and who are safe, right, and citizens to be in some of these events, right? So ultimately, I encourage folks to go, especially if you have the privilege to feel safe in those places, because much of this movement is relying on more numbers. And, bringing it back to the Midwest, as I mentioned, we have to organize a bit differently than Chicago and LA and DC, because it can't just be immigrant communities supporting immigrant communities. Many of us from other communities need to be involved as well. Thanks. Sure. You answered two of my questions. So you said community after 10 years, and you noticed the time in the Bean Station picture. Yeah.
So my
thank you.
question is, this was research done under the first Trump administration,
That's
correct?
right, yeah.
Are you doing research on this topic under this administration? And if so, what are the bigger changes that you're seeing?
No, under the current administration, I'm just crying. No, I'm just kidding. I'm not kidding. So yes, that's correct. This research all happened under Trump 1, which I'll remind folks wasn't even when we had the language or had this concept of mass deportation, right? So when Trump was elected, when Trump 2 began at the Republican event, and we remember the celebration, all those red balloons were dropping. Jacob Soboroff was the reporter there, and he was pointing out, look at all of these signs that say mass deportation now, right? Pointing out the irony of, this is a celebratory event. You will have no idea what this actually means. Stephen Miller picked this number of 1 million people a year. Again, Obama at his peak was about 500,000. 1 million people is rumored to have happened during, I hate the title or the name of the operation, but Operation Wetback in the 50s. But it was largely folks in my home state of Texas, Arizona, California returned across the border, right? I'm not comparing types of deportation. I am saying that the removal of people who have been in an area for 10 years is very different and requires us to at least consider these repercussions differently. So what are the other differences? One of the ones that I see is myself and others in public health. We spent so much of our time convincing people that ICE was violent, and we spent so much of our time convincing people that communities changed their behaviors and avoided healthcare because they were scared of ICE violence. And that research feels so quaint now. It was important. I'm glad we did it. I would do it again, but it's so obvious that racial profiling is involved, violence is involved. We used to have to work so hard to convince people that ICE operated without transparency. We see it so blatantly now. So what I would say is the difference is largely the scale. I mean, many of the arguments we were making are now blatant and are so obvious they don't need to be made in the same way.
Given that you've been seeing like violence rising among ICE, not only with immigrants themselves, but with members of the community, and what you've just been saying too about like it's only getting to scale more and more, like can ICE be reformed? And what does, like from your research, what does ethical immigration policy look like if it exists?
Sure. So to go with that last question, what does ethical immigration policy look like, right? So I'll begin by saying deportation is harmful all the time, every time, right? This is not just my opinion. This is what the research shows. This is what common sense shows. So it's always important in our policy decisions, whether we support those policies or not, to know the outcome. Deportation is always, always, always harmful, right? Just as a baseline, right? Folks often will support it despite knowing this, but this isn't really the point for debate. Of course it's harmful. Can ICE be reformed? I would say no, for a few reasons, right? One is which, remember, ICE has no accountability to anyone besides the president. So other law enforcement offices do. Sheriff is elected, right? We've elected our sheriff. And though we do not select our police chief, they're still accountable to the mayor and to the city attorney. We do elect the mayor, right? So there is accountability to other law enforcement offices. And police are accountable in a very different way, in which police actually operate wanting community trust because they need that trust for many of their daily operations, right? So police would say, no, it matters to us how the community sees this. ICE does not have that. There's nobody elected. There's no transparency. There's no way to actually complain about anybody, right? So it's not a system that I do not believe that system can be reformed. And I remind folks that ICE came about in like 2003, right? So like they're not very old. We have a system that has been, we had a system prior to ICE that did not involve ICE. So it is possible to change to a previous system or to a different version of our system. It will take imagining what it would look like, right, to have this different kind of immigration system. And I draw from Dr. Fleming's book, Imagine Doing Better, that often sometimes we hit our limit, and what we do is defend and protect what we have, and when that's falling apart, right, we try to reinstate it, instead of using this opportunity to envision what we could do beyond that. I hope I summarized your book well. Thank you, Paul. There's another question, I think, Trevor, do you have a mic? Yes.
Okay. You already partially answered my question, but I'm at the Ford School, so I'm looking at this from a policy perspective.
Yeah.
What are some of the checks and balances in place to keep ICE and DHS accountable, and why aren't they effective now?
Yeah, and I mean, it's good to think about if there are checks and balances to keep them accountable, right? And so an organization that is the head of the organization, Kristi Noem, serves at the pleasure of the president. Again, we elect the president, we do not elect her. So, and what tends to happen with ICE, along with DHS, is they will enforce immigration law as the president prefers. So we saw, for example, in Trump 1, we returned to worksite raids. Obama did not like these raids, so he did not do them. Biden did not like these raids, so he had them in Trump 1. One of the first things Biden said is like, yeah, we're not doing that anymore. He did other immigration deportation tactics, sure, and we returned to Trump 2, and we see these raids again, right? So there's no accountability, and the preference, how the operation unfolds is actually completely up to the president, right? What checks and balances should be in place? One of the things that happens also is because there's no local ICE office, because ICE does not need any support from the community, they can go in there and really screw things up, right? Because they don't have community buy-in at all. So I think going back to your point, right, what are the checks and balances in a model, in an organization that solely exists to remove people, right? So police exist to do many other things. I'm not trying to compare or justify one or the other, but I am saying ICE only exists to remove people. So people's response to ICE is based on that. Part of the issue would be offering other pathways to citizenship, or other pathways to legal protection. We've even done that, right? We had TPS for folks from Venezuela. Trump removed it. So we're also seeing not only this period of mass deportation, but also this period of mass delegalization, where folks who have legal status to be in a place see that disappear overnight. And thanks to Christina for introducing me to this idea of delegalization. Great question, yeah.
So you talked about communities in the aftermath of work site raids. Do you see now differences in communities who maybe have a lot of like immigrant workers, or like maybe non-immigrants who are not residents but like work in an area? Do you see those communities like preemptively preparing for these raids, especially in this Trump 2 era?
Yeah, so one of the biggest predictors of a successful response to an immigration enforcement event like this is simply having a close community beforehand, right? So I would say the idea of preparing before a raid, for raids specifically, not necessarily do you see that, but you do see lots of efforts to bring communities together. The Mount Pleasant raid I show here was one of the best responses. And the reason why that response was so coherent is because Trish, actually, a woman we call Trish, who operated one of their organizations there, had actually been organizing with the immigrant community for many, many years, right? I think it was 10 years. And she used this organizing for refugees, and then used it for undocumented students and undocumented folks in Iowa generally. And then when the raid happened, she was able to use all that infrastructure she already created to respond to the raid. So the best way to prepare for something that is perhaps statistically rare, right, is to be able to have this community in place beforehand.
Hello. My question kind of has to do with changing the broader narrative around immigrants and immigration in the United States. So I'm curious if the white folks, especially in these communities, tended to be more on the conservative side, and this really changed their position on immigration, seeing the impacts of this on people that they knew and cared about, if that kind of like broke into empathy a little bit in a way that they hadn't seen before. And if there were people for whom that happened, is there any movement around those people going to other communities in the United States who may not have experience with undocumented folks and talking to them about the humanity in this issue, and that it's not just this thing that is being like fanned on Fox News and whatnot?
Yeah. So when Juana worked in the food pantry, right, she often met other folks from the community, not all of whom were Latino. Poverty exists in these communities, and poverty is not just a thing of immigrant communities. There are low-income white folks in Mount Pleasant too. So one of the interesting things that would happen is that Juana would work alongside other white volunteers, and that white folks would come in and get food from Juana, and Latinos would come in and get food from white volunteers, and vice versa, right? So the organizing that happens after these events, yes, actually does serve a purpose of humanizing often the immigrant community for the white community, in a way that didn't exist before, because there was not, especially you saw some of those proportions of Latino, you think 7%, there wasn't a lot of opportunity for these two communities to mix. Even the masses, right? If you all have been to a Spanish Mass, the Spanish Mass is usually at that kind of odd time, or it's the evening time, you have the family playing the instruments, right? And it's mostly Spanish, and these two communities don't mix. So these events, as well as we talked about earlier, rallies and protests, like the protests we saw down the center of town in Bean Station in Morristown, Tennessee, did serve this purpose of, yes, humanizing, right, Latino immigrants to the white community. I want to complicate this a little bit, because one of the things that we saw also in the case of many educators is that they would say, I saw my students as students. I did not see them as black, brown, white, purple. Sometimes they would list colors that were clearly not skin color, right? And they fed them, right? They provided food to these students. Great and important work. I will continue to talk about it and continue to document it. And it really pushed me to think about if you don't see this as a racial project, as a racialized deportation regime, where's going to be the limit of your goodwill, right? I'm really worried that like once you fed those children, right, once you fed your students and these families weren't being separated, are you going to let immigrant communities live in poverty with no political representation and few paths to citizenship because everybody kind of has a baseline level of humanity now, right? So this idea of we need to see immigrant communities as human, first of all, yes. Second of all, I admit I find it fatiguing. And I find that like, do you really have to meet people before you can treat them as humans? And does treating people as humans only mean you're going to feed them and count on them being together? Or can we support these communities in broader ways? It's a really good question. And you know, toward the end of the book, I have this conversation with someone who provided essential material support to somebody whose father was deported, but who later told us that she saw Latinos as inherently genetically inferior than white people. And I wrestle with this question, you know, and I don't answer it in the book because I want you all to think of what the answer is. But do you have to what level, to what extent do we have to accept support from people who see us as subhuman, right? How desperate does the situation have to be? And to push in the other direction, stop seeing immigrants as subhuman, right? Like this is a simple argument of like, no, the humanization does not have to happen first. You can support resources without knowing people. You can provide resources and provide political representation.
I'm curious, a lot of your presentation focuses on the health-related costs. I'm curious if you have any information surrounding like the economic impact of the large-scale communities and some of like the messaging that can be had there. You know, I think a lot of what the administration is responding to is a lot of capitalist reactions, and so I'm wondering if you have any like anything to speak on in that.
Yeah, so this was sent to me by someone in Chicago today. Chilling raids could lead to rising rents, right? Another public health idea that like, once you know it, you can't unknow it, pretty obvious. So if you remember last month, ICE rappelled out of helicopters, landed on this apartment, cut a hole in the apartment roof, came in and arrested families in what was predominantly an African-American apartment, right? This is an important part of the story we didn't dig into today. There's not going to be, first of all, as it says here, there's costs of repair. Second of all, those families are moving out. Third of all, there's not going to be people moving in. And this is the building that ICE directly targeted, right? But we can say, like, what about the neighborhood? What about all of these rent prices are going to go up because Latinos are not only, immigrant communities are not only producers, like we're not only doing things like working, but we're also consumers. We're also paying rent. We're also buying from stores and restaurants, right? And when you wipe out, or at least prevent a portion of your community from being consumers, things like rising rent prices happen, right? So we see lots of economic costs. We see fruit rotting in the fields, right, from fruit that can't be picked by our agricultural workers. I'm going to bring up another complicated piece of that fruit rotting in the fields argument. So my grandfather came from Mexico in about 1947, and he worked in a tire factory, in the GM factory nearby in Pontiac, Michigan, right? And he was working on tires, and one day his right arm gets caught in the tire making machine, and he lost his right arm, right? He lost his arm doing this labor of making cars, right? Ironically, you know, sold in the Motor City that we buy. And I know like many other Latino families feel this same way. They're like, our families have already paid with their bodies. I don't really make a lot of economic arguments anymore. I don't really make a lot of arguments that, no, we contribute and we do the work that nobody else wants to do. Do I think they should be made? Yeah. I find them difficult to make myself sometimes. And I like telling you all that because I know I'm not the only person that feels that way. I know there's others who find this neoliberal argument of like, no, we need Latinos or else our fruit rots, to be a little uncomfortable. Is it important to make? Yes. Do I hope you make it? Yeah. I'm not very good at making it, and that's why.
So I think we have room for one more question. and we'll ask it here.
Hi, first of all, thank you so much, Dr. Lopez. So my question is that it seems like all these worksite rates kind of targeting the male demographics. So I'm just wondering if there is any cases where like ICE go to the neighborhoods and kind of like detain the mothers, children's, or like these family members, or are they always, these family members being left alone to fend for themselves? Yeah,
Did you
thank
say male demographic? Is that what you said?
Yeah.
Yeah. So most of these, so a few things to know about, right, when we say a gendered deportation regime, right? I want to be clear that not all families are a man and a woman, and I also want to be clear that a family that has children, right, so there's reproductive focus, I'm very aware that this is not the only argument we want to make. We do not only want to protect, right, this quintessential male-female reproductive family. I'm well aware of that. Why does it tend to happen in immigrant communities? There is a few reasons for that, right? One is that the type of work available to undocumented folks is often labor. So here it's roofing, landscaping, it's often construction, right? Which tends to be done by men. Communities will often, or rather undocumented families will often pool risk. So if someone is working, often the husband, the mother will stay home. So it's not universally men working and women at home, but it does happen often, right? So this raid, 284 people in the CVE technology factory in Allen, Texas, a cell phone factory, so less cement mixing kind of labor and more assembly line-like detailed kind of labor, which was done mostly by women. O'Neill, Nebraska was also very similar. There was more women taken by men, more women taken than men. And when this happens, right, many of these families are in the stage where they are having young children. So one of the things that we see is ICE doesn't really want the paperwork of detaining mothers. It's simpler to detain fathers and deport fathers. In O'Neill, many women, some of whom were pregnant, so the story that you heard from Anika, were stuck on a bus for multiple hours. I think it was 14 hours, right? And these women, many had infants, some were pregnant and nursing their children. So there are so ICE takes this into account and tends to take men because it's often simpler. But yes, I do appreciate, is it always men? No, it's often women as well. Is it mostly men? Generally speaking, yes. Is it often wives and mothers left behind? Often, yes, but that is not exclusively the case.
Well, let's give Bill a proper round of applause. Excellent work. Look forward to seeing you all next week. Have a great week.
Thank you, everybody. And thank you, School of Public Health. Thank you, sir.